Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the secret sauce that takes a digital product from merely functional to absolutely unforgettable. We're going to uncover the specific tips and tricks designers use to make interfaces feel genuinely alive through tiny, deliberate details. If you've ever wondered how top-tier teams elevate user engagement and build a cohesive brand feel, well, you are in exactly the right place.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the magic in details, break down the anatomy of a microinteraction, cover some essential tips for functional animation, dive into tricks for haptic feedback, and finally, explore designing motion identity.
All right, part one, the magic in details. Small touches, massive impact. Now, since you're already familiar with UI design, you definitely know the basics of microinteractions, right? They're those brief, single-purpose feedback mechanisms or animations that make our screens feel more human. But as seasoned designers, it's absolutely crucial to look past just the satisfying pings or the visual flair of a Snapchat streak. The real trick is recognizing that these moments are the icing on the cake of your design. They aren't the primary functionality, sure, but without them, the experience just feels mechanical, dry, and totally disconnected from the user.
What's really fascinating here is the behavioral psychology at play. Delivering that instant, delightful feedback actually triggers a dopamine release in the user's brain. It creates this tiny, satisfying sense of accomplishment. You know that feeling when you check off a task in a to-do app and you get that slick little strike-through animation along with a subtle click? That's the dopamine talking. This psychological reward system ensures your users keep coming back for more, because interacting with your product fundamentally feels good on a neurological level. It's a massive trick for building long-term habit loops.
Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of a Microinteraction, the engine under the hood.
Dan Saffer really hit the nail on the head when he broke down these mechanics. He showed that every single microinteraction follows a precise four-step loop. First up, you have the trigger, which could be manual, like tapping a like button, or systematic, like an oven beeping when it hits 350 degrees. Second, we have the rules. These dictate what can or cannot happen next based on set parameters. Third is the feedback, which is the actual verification you see, hear, or feel. And finally, loops and modes. These dictate the length and operational state. To give you a practical example, if you flip your phone into Do Not Disturb mode, the rules governing your app's notification microinteractions fundamentally shift until that mode is toggled off.
So, with the engine mapped out, how do we actually apply these rules visually? Let's pivot and look at some highly practical tips to make sure our on-screen motion genuinely helps the user rather than getting in their way.
Section 3. Tips for functional animation. Making motion purposeful.
A crucial tip here is to anchor your work in these 9 scientifically backed principles. Let's zero in on a few of the most important ones. Functionality means every single animation absolutely must serve a genuine purpose. Attention dictates that motion should natively guide the user's eye to what matters, without acting like a flashy distraction. And when you combine stylistic consistency with smoothness, you create an environment the user subconsciously trusts simply because it behaves predictably, like objects in the physical world. Also, keep a close eye on duration. Your interface is a tool, so animations need to be lightning fast. Never force a user to wait around just to watch a pretty transition finish.
Building right on top of that, Apple's UI best practices command us to keep animations fast, precise, and grounded in physical realism. But here's a vital, often overlooked accessibility trick: make motion optional. Always allow users who need to reduce motion, maybe due to vestibular sensitivities or motion sickness, to turn these animations off entirely. It's a fundamental step that separates merely good design from truly professional, empathetic design.
Okay, so those are the visual rules. But how do these principles build when we shift our focus from a glass screen to physical touch? That brings us to Section 4, Tricks for Haptic Feedback, Designing for Touch.
Think of haptics as your secret weapon for minimizing user mistakes and providing deep reassurance. Take Apple Pay, for example. When you double-click the side button, you don't just see visual confirmation, you feel this distinct mechanical feeling vibration, and you hear a crisp beep. Take a second and just mentally recall exactly how that physical sensation feels in your hand. That haptic feedback mimics natural touch, confirming your transaction was successful without you even needing to stare at the screen.
To execute this flawlessly in your own apps, keep these straightforward tricks in mind. Keep it subtle. A phone aggressively buzzing at every single tap is just exhausting, not to mention a battery killer. Be consistent with your patterns so users subconsciously learn the physical language of your app over time. Always provide the control to turn it off. And critically, leverage haptics as an accessibility tool for the visually impaired. It offers tactile cues that flat screens alone simply cannot provide. Now, when scaling these principles up into future tech like virtual reality, you run into some fascinating trade-offs. For VR text entry, researchers found you can actually put actuators directly on the user's fingers for incredibly high granularity, letting them feel exactly which virtual key they tapped. But honestly, that setup is bulky and really inhibits natural hand movement. The alternative? Putting a single actuator on the wrist, kind of like a smartwatch. It has lower spatial granularity, sure, but it is wildly more practical and comfortable for the user. It's all about picking the right trick for the right hardware context.
Which leads us to a really compelling question. Can motion and feedback elevate beyond simple usability? Can the way a window minimizes or a menu pops open actually communicate the core personality of a massive global brand? Let's find out in Section 5, Designing Motion Identity, the Aesthetic Expression of Brand Style.
Researchers completely isolated 12 motion samples across Windows, macOS, and Huawei's Harmony OS to systematically evaluate how motion shapes aesthetic experience. They didn't just look at random animations, though. They broke the interactions down into 4 specific categories. It's super interesting to see how they evaluated things like affective motion, tracking how an interface element pulses or breathes when a voice assistant is listening, compared to just standard operational feedback.
To decode this brand identity, researchers conceptualized the system motion through 3 core attributes. First is the temporal attribute, which maps out the rhythm and speed of the animation. Second is the spatial attribute, looking at organization, scale, and depth within the screen. And third is transformational, which measures the rigidity versus the elastic liveliness of the interface elements as they shift states. When you look at the specific spatial and temporal mappings charted out here, it proves something amazing. Adjusting these parameters by just milliseconds or tweaking a few pixels of depth completely alters the perceptual dynamic structure of the software. This is the ultimate trick of high-level UI. You aren't just making things wiggle on a screen, you are literally programming a personality through math and physics. By scoring these motions against 6 specific adjectives, elegant, fluent, dynamic, professional, refined, and friendly, designers can deliberately shape how a user perceives a brand. Are you going for a serious corporate vibe or a warm, approachable one? The way your menus slide and bounce will dictate that emotional response long before a user reads a single word of text. The final result of the study highlights this perfectly. Harmony OS intentionally utilizes continuous curves and elastic deformation. The result? The system feels warm, lively, dynamic, and friendly. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, macOS and Windows heavily prioritize stability and direct, precise paths. This subtly projects a highly refined, professional, and competent aesthetic, purely through the physics of their motion design.
So, armed with these structural tips, psychological insights, and advanced motion tricks, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. When you sit down to build your next product, how will you harness the magic of microinteractions and haptics to transform your interface from merely functional to truly unforgettable? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I absolutely cannot wait to see what you design next.